It's an addiction. It grabs you, even though it may not be good for you.
Get rid of. I would have severe cravings, and I realized at that point I was completely hooked.
People who suffer from anxiety, they're particularly vulnerable to having issues with nicotine.
We go through what's called a brain growth spurt that occurs during adolescence.
E-cigarette use, or vaping, has grown an astonishing 900% among high school students.
Virtually every e-cigarette contains nicotine, and kids are getting hooked.
Critics say that vaping is just another form of nicotine addiction.
In a recent survey, over 37% of high school seniors reported vaping. Vaping is also becoming more common among middle school and even elementary students.
It started around the time I was 12 or 13. I definitely thought it was a lot safer than cigarettes.
When I first started vaping, everybody would say, yeah, it's safer than cigarettes.
I just knew that cigarettes were bad for you and beats in lungs.
Most users argue that when compared to smoking cigarettes, vaping is safe. But research indicates that there are dangers. While the e-juices in vaping devices don't contain a lot of the cancer-causing chemicals found in tobacco smoke, many contain significant amounts of nicotine. Take, for example, a single pod of e-juice contains 5 milligrams of nicotine.
Actually higher in a shorter period of time.
Like any addictive substance, nicotine can have profound effects on the brain, particularly the adolescent brain highway system that allows information to flow between many different locations. There are about 100 billion nerve cells. A neuron can form thousands of connections with other neurons. According to some estimates, the typical brain has over 100 trillion connections. These connections form an intricate communications network that regulates our social interactions, our emotions, how we move, how we learn, and how we make decisions. During adolescence, these connections get stronger. At the same time, the brain gets more efficient because excess neurons and connections that aren't used get paired or reduced.
One thinks about the adolescent brain as fine-tuning itself. We're going to reduce neurons we don't need, and we're going to strengthen the connections of the neurons that we do need.
All kinds of new connections are being made, and so there's an opportunity for change. There's an opportunity to learn new things. The more you challenge it, like with math or a sport, the more your brain will accommodate that and help you to be successful.
The adolescent brain is still in this phenomenal changing state. It is adapting to environments, it's adapting to people, it's adapting to experiences.
But the ability of the adolescent brain to change also makes it more susceptible to damage caused by addictive substances.
An addictive substance has essence. The brain is changing at far greater rates than it is when we're adults.
For the buzz, the nicotine buzz, it very quickly became something that I wanted to do.
Nicotine gets into the brain within about 10. It's distributed to the brain rapidly, thoroughly, and in sufficiently high doses to produce immediate effects.
Nicotine, like any addictive drug, affects a circuit in the release of a neurotransmitter or chemical messenger called dopamine. Dopamine is associated with feelings of pleasure.
There are many things that affect the reward pathway. If you love ice cream, love running, you may get what people call a runner's high and you feel really good. It hits that reward center.
We feel pleasure from important natural rewards such as water and food, sex, and nurturing. All these things increase the levels of dopamine in the brain. But addictive drugs, when people first start using drugs, including nicotine, it isn't because the drugs make them feel bad. They make them feel good, or at least better, and at least for a while.
It made me feel calm, relaxed.
You inhale and it's a very satisfying experience.
Once you hit it, you just want more.
If nicotine affects dopamine levels so that we experience a buzz or feel calmer, what's wrong with that? There are other things that happen. With repeated use, nicotine changes the brain. Among other consequences, it means people who continue to vape develop a tolerance to the drug. Tolerance. a state in which a person no longer responds to a drug in the way that person initially responded. Chronic use of nicotine alters the brain's ability to respond to the drug. What used to give vapers a buzz or make them feel relaxed,
To vape, they're going to need to vape more because the vaping process itself is changing brain chemistry.
It increased dramatically to the point where I was like, now currently I vape probably every 10 or 15 minutes.
It ends up you're hitting it more constantly, over and over and over.
You wake up and that's the first thing you do. You have your vape.
one of the consequences of developing tolerance to nicotine can be that the user also becomes dependent on nicotine. Dependence, a state in which a person can function normally only in the presence of a drug. The process of becoming dependent on nicotine is one in which you vape nicotine and initially it feels good. But after a while, the brain adjusts so that nicotine doesn't make you feel bad. Trying to stop vaping leads to nicotine withdrawal. Use of a drug is reduced or stopped. Symptomability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, depressed mood, frustration, anger, increased hunger, and difficulty sleeping.
Your brain will not let you rest. Your body will not let you rest.
Just general discomfort, like you can't really sit still.
It's that little green monster on your back that you just can't get rid of. You're always thinking about it.
You're trying to focus on other things and it keeps pulling you towards it.
I would have, headaches if I stopped for more than, 2 or 3 hours.
It grabs you, even though it may not be good for you.
Addiction, a brain disease that is manifested by compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences.
When you're at the point where you're addicted, you can't just stop. Your brain will not let you rest. You are no longer doing it for fun. You're no longer doing it to have a great time.
People lose the ability to control the behavior, even though they know.
At first, I would say vaping is more voluntary because you're choosing to smoke it to get a nicotine high, and then it becomes more compulsive.
Vaping is a loss of control and a loss of kind of like a big part of your life. It's something you're always thinking about.
In addition to nicotine, another reason that vaping is so addictive is the fact that the activity is repeated so often and in conjunction with so many other activities.
A lot of the behavior that's associated with the addictiveness isn't just nicotine, but the behavior as well. Independent of what they're vaping becomes addictive. Bringing something to your mouth, holding it in your hands, raising it with your right hand versus your left is all part of this ritualistic process that creates the addictiveness.
For me, it's like the oral fixation it's the action of like vaping, like hitting it, smoking it, setting it down, that type of thing that I can't really get rid of.
It was very, very hard for me to quit.
For people who have become addicted to nicotine, quitting is not easy because the brain associates vaping with so many activities they find pleasurable. The brain is conditioned to expect nicotine in certain situations. People who try to quit relapse or resume vaping because there are cues in the environment that can trigger cravings for the drug.
Stopping just seems like one of those things where I don't think it would ever happen. It's too much of an ingrained part of my day. It's too much of a habit. Right when I get into the car, I have it right in my cup holder next to me, and I'll turn my car on, get it going, I make sure that it's there along with my phone, and then I take off and my window's already down, and it just kind of happens like without even thinking about it.
What we see is the number one cause of relapse to drug-seeking behavior are environmental triggers, where we talk about people, places, and things. The same thing goes on with vaping. If individuals vape together, they're vaping with their friends, when they run into their friends in 2 days, there's a powerful cue.
There's a definite social ritual with vaping, with friends in general.
Exposing the developing adolescent brain to nicotine can lead to lifelong addiction, and the addiction might not be limited to vaping.
The data that's out there today demonstrates that kids who vape nicotine are 4 times more likely to start smoking cigarettes compared to kids who don't vape.
I would have never smoked regular cigarettes if I hadn't begun with e-cigarettes and gotten addicted.
Want to smoke if you juul or vape. It was the gateway, I feel, into cigarettes.
There is also evidence that nicotine primes the brain in ways that make other addictions more likely.
Exposure to nicotine during adolescence increases the likelihood that an individual will transition to other
anymore. Once it wasn't really, taking care of the anxiety that I was feeling and depression and, things that come along with like teenage years, I brought the same habits to other substances. It was weed, alcohol, cocaine, whatever. Anything that made me feel the way that I wanted to feel.
Young people are particularly at risk for psychological complications from nicotine addiction because nicotine disrupts the development of a part of the brain called the frontal lobes, which aren't fully mature until around ages 24 or 25. The frontal lobes are important for planning ahead, making judgments, controlling impulses, and regulating emotions.
From years and years, decades worth of data, is introducing addictive substances like nicotine consequences. We see increases in the incidence of depression. We see increases in the incidence of cognitive decline.
I could see that vaping could be a gateway or an open door to, deeper mental health issues like depression.
Vaping does alter my mood. If I'm in a depressive state, this little sunshine ball turns into a little rain cloud.
Nicotine vaping created a cycle of enhanced anxiety for me, basically feeling bad most of the time.
There is also evidence that nicotine affects our ability to learn and focus. In experiments with adolescent rats, exposure to nicotine increased their impulsive behavior and made it harder for them to focus their attention, and these tendencies persisted into adulthood. We don't know for sure if the same thing happens with humans, but researchers are concerned that it may. We do know necessary neurons and strengthens the connections between the neurons that remain, and that nicotine interferes with this process.
When you introduce a compound like nicotine, you alter the rigidity or the strength of the neurons that are going to remain. So we now can run into problems with not being attentive, the inability to focus, inability to integrate concepts within a framework. It can have a profound impact on the developing brain.
The impact of vaping on the brain and addiction to nicotine have other possible health consequences. E-cigarettes do not produce many of the thousands of chemicals found in cigarette smoke, many of which cause cancer. However, we are finding out that while vaping may be safer than smoking, safer does not mean safe.
New warning suggesting a potential link between teen vaping and e-cigarette use to severe lung disease.
The CDC investigating a medical mystery spreading across the country tonight. Dozens of young people sick with potentially dangerous lung illnesses. Health officials linking it to e-cigarettes and vaping.
Well, more and more concerns this morning about e-cigarettes and vaping. A patient died from a severe respiratory illness, and it could be the country's first vaping-related death.
E-cigarettes have been around for only a few years. There are many unknowns about vaping, including the effects of the chemicals that make up the vapor and how they affect physical health over the long term.
I think that what we're going to find is that vaping is going to be the cause of far more illnesses than we predict now, and far more chronic diseases than people had thought of originally. Because there's so much we don't know. And yet the stuff we do know is already really unfortunate.
What we know already is that nicotine can interfere with the development of the adolescent brain at a time when it would normally become stronger and more efficient. We know that nicotine is highly addictive and that the adolescent brain is at greater risk of addiction. We know that once addicted to vaping, it is extremely hard to quit because of cravings and symptoms of withdrawal. We know that young people who vape are far more likely to later start smoking, and that nicotine primes the brain so that it is more likely to become addicted to other substances as well. We know that nicotine can affect our emotions, making us more anxious and more depressed. We know that nicotine also can affect memory, learning, and our ability to focus, and that these effects may last a lifetime.
It just created a cycle of anxiety, withdrawal, and cravings. You don't want to have anything to do with that.
It makes me crave something that I don't need. So it's another barrier just between me and what I really need to deal with and how I really need to get healthy.
It might not seem like such a big deal. It might seem like such a small thing because everybody's doing it, but it's something that you have to carry with for the rest of your life if you can't overcome it. And it's a lot harder than you'd think to overcome.